That evening began like any other evening. In a life that I believed was stable, structured, and quietly predictable. The kind of life where nothing extraordinary ever happens and where trust feels like the most natural foundation, holding everything together. But by the time the sun had fully disappeared behind the skyline of Chicago and the city lights started reflecting, on my kitchen window like scattered fragments of a broken truth, I had already stepped into a reality I could never return from, because I discovered that my husband, the man I had built my entire world around, was secretly involved with his boss. And I was the last person on earth to know what had been happening right under my own roof. My name is Samantha. I am the woman who believed in loyalty more than anything else in this world, the kind of woman who does not question her marriage because she believes love does not need constant interrogation to survive. 34 years old, living in what I thought was a stable middle-class American life, with a man I trusted completely, a man I thought was working late for our future, a man I defended even when I felt lonely, and a woman who never imagined that the quiet absence of honesty could be more destructive than any loud argument. My husband's name was Daniel Mercer, and for years, I believed he was a dedicated professional in a corporate consulting firm, always exhausted, always busy, always carrying the weight of responsibility that I thought was meant to secure our future, while I stayed home managing the house, managing the silence, and managing the belief that sacrifice in marriage was normal, even noble, until the night everything collapsed without warning and forced me to see every moment of my life through a completely different lens. It started with small inconsistencies that I had ignored for months. The way he started guarding his phone with unusual care, the way his work calls became more private, the way his schedule extended without explanation, and the way his presence in our home felt physically closer but emotionally further, as if he was sitting in the same room, but living in an entirely different world that I was never allowed to enter. Yet I convinced myself that this was simply the pressure of career advancement, because believing in betrayal is always more painful than believing in stress. The truth began to surface in fragments that did not make sense at first, like pieces of a puzzle scattered across different moments of time until the night. I noticed a notification flash briefly on his phone while he was in the shower, a message preview that mentioned late meetings and private discussions, with someone named Victoria, his direct superior at work, and something about the tone of that message felt too personal, too familiar, too emotionally charged to belong to a simple professional relationship. But I still told myself that suspicion is a dangerous thing when it is not confirmed. So I stayed silent. That silence, I would later understand, was the exact environment where betrayal grows without resistance. The next day, I did something I had never done before in my entire marriage. I checked the calendar he left open on his laptop, not because I wanted to invade his privacy, but because a part of me had already begun to feel that reality was shifting in ways I could not ignore. And what I found there was not just unusual, it was devastatingly structured, because there were repeated entries labeled as client meetings that aligned perfectly with late evenings. But what made my chest tighten was the recurring pattern of private location, tags outside the city office, always at upscale hotels or private lounges that no normal corporate meeting would require. And yet I still did not want to believe it, because believing it meant destroying everything I had spent years building emotionally. But the human mind has a cruel way of forcing truth forward when denial becomes too heavy to sustain. 2 nights later, I followed him. Not in a dramatic way, not with confrontation, not with anger, but with a silence so deep, it felt like I was leaving my own identity behind as I drove through the city streets at a distance, watching his car move through familiar routes that slowly became unfamiliar, when he did not stop at his office, when he did not stop at any corporate building, but instead turned toward a hotel in the downtown district that I had only ever seen in advertisements for luxury business conferences. I remember sitting in my car for a long time after he parked, watching the entrance. Doors of that hotel open and close like a revolving gateway into a world I was never meant to enter. And I remember how my hand stayed still, on the steering wheel even, though my entire body felt like it was collapsing inward, because I did not want to see what my mind was already preparing me for. But I saw it anyway. He walked in with confidence that did not belong to secrecy, and within minutes, I saw another car arrive, and a woman stepped out with the kind of elegance that did not belong to coincidence. Victoria, the same name that had once appeared in that message, the same woman who held authority over his professional life, and yet the way they moved toward each other made it immediately clear that their connection had nothing to do with business and everything to do with something far more personal, far more dangerous, and far more intimate than I had ever allowed myself to imagine. I did not cry immediately. That surprised me more than anything. Instead, I felt a strange stillness, as if my emotions had stepped back to allow my mind to observe the destruction more clearly. And in that moment, I understood something terrifying, that betrayal does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives with silence, structure, repetition, and routine, until it becomes normal enough to hide in plain sight. I drove back home that night in complete silence, not because I had accepted what I saw, but because I was trying to understand how long I had been living inside, a version of my life that had been carefully edited without my knowledge. And as I entered my house, every object I touched felt unfamiliar, every memory felt rewritten, and every belief I held about my marriage began to collapse into something I could no longer trust. And yet the most painful realization was still waiting for me. Because betrayal is never just about what someone did. It is about how long they did it, without you noticing. I sat alone in my bedroom that night, staring at the empty space beside me where Daniel was supposed to be. And for the first time in years, I stopped seeing him as my husband and started seeing him as a man who had built a double life so carefully that I had been living inside the illusion of loyalty while he was living somewhere else entirely. And that was the exact moment something inside me shifted permanently, not into anger, not into sadness, but into awareness. Because once you see the truth, you can never return to ignorance again. And what I did not know yet, what I could not possibly understand, in that silent breaking moment, was that this discovery was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of something far more calculated, far more controlled, and far more devastating than anything they could ever expect from a woman they believed had already been defeated by love itself. And by the time morning arrived, I was no longer the same woman who had trusted blindly. I was the woman who now knew everything, and silence for the first time belonged to me. The morning after, the truth entered my life like an uninvited shadow that refused to leave. I woke up with the unsettling awareness that something inside me had changed. Permanently, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in a quiet, internal shift that made even the familiar corners of my own home feel slightly distant, as if I was no longer living inside my life, but observing it from a place of emotional separation where everything looked the same but felt entirely redefined. Daniel acted as if nothing had happened. He moved through the house with the same routine confidence, preparing his coffee, checking his phone, adjusting his tie with the same unconscious precision that I had once found comforting. And watching him in that moment created a strange contradiction inside me because I was now carrying a truth so heavy that it altered every detail of his ordinary behavior, while he continued to exist in a version of reality where I still knew nothing at all. That was the first moment I understood something deeply unsettling. A person can live a double life so smoothly that their deception becomes indistinguishable from normality, and the more normal he appeared, the more abnormal I felt. I began to observe him differently that day, not with confrontation or emotional reaction, but with a controlled awareness that felt like stepping outside of myself, noticing the small patterns I had ignored for years, the way he checked his phone with slight hesitation before letting it rest face down, the way he smiled without fully engaging his eyes, the way his attention seemed divided even when he was physically present, as if part of him was always somewhere else entirely. Every detail now had weight, every gesture had meaning. Every silence felt like it was carrying something hidden inside it. I spent the morning cleaning the house in a mechanical rhythm, not because it needed cleaning, but because movement was the only way I could prevent my thoughts from collapsing into emotional chaos. And while I worked, I kept returning mentally to the image I could not erase from my memory: the hotel entrance, the controlled confidence in his steps, and Victoria's arrival, with the kind of familiarity that did not belong to professional boundaries. What hurt the most was not just the betrayal itself, but the realization that it had structure. This was not accidental. This was not emotional confusion. This was repeated intention. And repeated intention means choice. By midday, I found myself sitting in the kitchen staring at nothing in particular, while my mind started forming questions I had never allowed myself to consider before. Questions about how long this had been happening, how many nights had been erased from my awareness, how many conversations had been disguised as work calls, and how many moments of my life had been shared with a man who was not fully present in them. The emotional pain was no longer sharp. It was becoming organized, and that organization frightened me more than the discovery itself. Because pain that begins to structure itself stops behaving like emotion and starts behaving like calculation. Later that afternoon, I noticed something that changed the direction of my thoughts completely. Daniel had left his laptop open again, something he rarely did unless he was confident in his privacy. And this time I did not hesitate, not because I was acting impulsively, but because something inside me had already crossed a boundary that could not be reversed. And what I found inside was not just confirmation, but expansion. There were documents, calendar entries that extended further, back than I had expected, repeated travel patterns, private meeting notes that were carefully disguised under corporate terminology, but arranged with such consistency that they revealed a parallel routine existing alongside our marriage. And then there were emails, short, coded, emotionally neutral on the surface, but unmistakably personal beneath it. Exchanges between Daniel and Victoria that carried the tone of familiarity built over time rather than sudden attraction, which meant the betrayal was not new, not recent, not accidental, but something that had been growing quietly long before I ever suspected it. I closed the laptop slowly, not out of shock, but out of recognition, because now I understood the scale. This was not a mistake in his life. This was a second life, and I had been living outside it without knowing. When Daniel returned that evening, I studied him again, but this time with a different kind of awareness. Not the awareness of a victim, but the awareness of someone who was beginning to understand structure, patterns, timing, and behavior. And I noticed how carefully he avoided unnecessary conversation, how he maintained emotional distance even in casual interactions, and how his presence in the house felt increasingly like a temporary stay, rather than belonging. He was not nervous. That was the most important realization. He was comfortable, which meant he did not believe. He was at risk of being exposed. That belief created a dangerous imbalance, because people who feel safe in their deception stop protecting it. That night I did not sleep. Instead, I lay in silence listening to the subtle sounds of the house settling into darkness, and my mind began shifting in a direction I did not initially recognize as planning. But that is exactly what it was becoming. Not emotional reaction, not impulsive anger, but structured awareness forming into something controlled and deliberate. For the first time since discovering the truth, I did not ask myself what I should do. I asked myself what I needed to understand before I did anything at all. Because I now realize something essential. Revenge is not created in emotion. It is created in information, and I was only beginning to collect mine. The days that followed did not feel like days anymore, but rather like carefully measured intervals of observation, where I moved through my life with a calm exterior while internally mapping every detail that had once seemed ordinary but now carried meaning, because once a truth of this magnitude enters a person's awareness, even the smallest gesture begins to speak in a language that cannot be ignored, and I found myself listening to everything without ever raising my voice. Daniel continued his routine with increasing confidence, almost as if nothing in his life required adjustment, and that confidence itself became another layer of confirmation for me. Because people who are hiding something usually live with fragments of fear, but he carried none of it visibly, which meant either he was extremely practiced at deception or he genuinely believed that nothing about his double life could ever reach me, and both possibilities revealed something important about the structure of his betrayal. I stopped reacting emotionally altogether, not because the pain disappeared, but because emotion was no longer useful in the space I had entered. Instead, I began to observe patterns with precision, noting the times he left, the subtle shifts in his schedule, the recurring late evenings that matched inconsistent explanations, and the way his attention drifted when certain names or topics came close to areas of his hidden life, especially anything related to his workplace, where Victoria existed as both authority and connection in a way that now represented the center of everything. I was slowly beginning to understand. What I had once seen as emotional, betrayal was transforming into something more structural, a system, not a pattern, a controlled arrangement of time, distance, and secrecy. And systems, unlike emotions, can be understood. One evening, while Daniel was in the shower, and the house was filled with the familiar sound of running water masking everything else, I found myself standing near his desk again. Not with hesitation this time, but with a calm certainty that I had never experienced before, and I accessed what I needed, without emotional disturbance, because at this point I was no longer searching for proof of betrayal. I was studying its architecture. What I discovered confirmed something. even deeper than before. Their communication was not sporadic. It was structured, scheduled, integrated into his work life in a way that made it nearly impossible to distinguish professional obligations from personal connection. And that integration was the most dangerous part of it all, because it meant he was not separating his worlds anymore, he was merging them in a way that gave him continuous access to both without raising suspicion. And I realized something that made my thoughts sharpen further. This was not just an affair. This was a life being maintained with discipline. When Daniel returned to the bedroom that night, I looked at him differently, not with anger, not with sadness, but with a clarity that removed illusion entirely, because the man I was seeing was no longer the man I had once believed I knew, but a carefully composed version of himself, who had learned how to exist in two realities without allowing either one to collapse. He spoke less to me that evening, or perhaps I simply noticed more. Every interaction now felt minimal, efficient, designed to maintain appearance rather than connection, and I realized how long I had been mistaking absence of truth for normal marital distance when in reality, it had been the gradual construction of emotional separation that I had simply failed to interpret correctly. That night, while he slept, I remained awake longer than I ever had before, not in distress but in calculation, because something fundamental had shifted inside me. Where pain had once occupied the center of my thoughts, now something colder and more focused had begun to take its place, and I began to understand that discovery alone changes nothing unless it is followed by direction, and direction requires clarity. So I started organizing everything in my mind like pieces of a structure that needed to be fully visible before any action could ever be considered, because reacting without understanding would only give power back to confusion, and I was no longer willing to live inside confusion of any kind. By the end of that night, I had not decided what I would do, but I had decided something far more important. I would no longer be a passive participant in a life where I was the last to know anything. From now on, I would be the one who understood everything first, and somewhere deep within that silence, where emotions used to dictate my reactions, a new awareness had fully formed, steady and controlled, waiting for the moment when understanding would finally turn into action. By the time I reached the stage where everything was about to change, I was no longer the woman who first suspected something was wrong in her marriage, because that version of me still carried hope, still searched for excuses, and still believed that love could survive dishonesty if it was not fully exposed. But now I understood something far more dangerous and far more powerful. The truth does not need permission to destroy illusions, it only needs patience. The silence I had maintained for so long was no longer weakness. It had transformed into structure, and every small discovery I had gathered about my husband's hidden life with his boss had become part of a much larger picture that I was no longer emotionally attached to, because emotional attachment was the only thing that had kept me blind in the beginning. I started making decisions that did not come from anger, but from clarity, and that clarity made everything. I did feel calm on the surface while carrying weight. Underneath that, no one around me could detect. Not even him when he looked at me with the same familiar expression that once meant safety but now only meant ignorance. What he did not realize was that the foundation of his comfort was already weakening, because I had already begun separating every shared responsibility, every financial dependency, and every emotional leverage point that connected my life to his, and I did it slowly enough that he never noticed the shift happening around him. Days passed like nothing was changing, and that was exactly what made it perfect. Because people who are guilty always believe silence means safety, while in reality silence is often preparation for consequence. Then came the moment that completed everything I had been building in private, when I discovered proof that was no longer based on suspicion or interpretation, but on undeniable truth that could not be explained away or minimized. And once I had that proof, something inside me became completely steady, like a storm finally choosing its direction. I did not rush to confront him. I did not raise my voice, and I did not seek emotional closure, because closure was never something he was going to give me willingly. So I decided to create it in a way that would not require his permission. The shift began on a day that looked completely ordinary from the outside. A day where he left home in the same controlled routine he had repeated for months, believing he was managing two lives without collision, not knowing that one of those lives was already being quietly removed from his control. By the time he reached his workplace environment, the structure around him was no longer what he remembered, because the information I had carefully placed into the right hands had already begun circulating in ways that could not be contained, not as accusation, but as documented reality that carried its own weight without needing my presence. The reaction did not come instantly, but it came inevitably because systems built on hidden relationships always collapse when exposure removes the illusion of professionalism, and what once looked like authority slowly started turning into accountability. I stayed distant during all of it, watching from a place where emotion could not interfere with judgment, and for the first time in a long time, I did not feel like someone reacting to life, but someone finally observing it from a position of control. When the consequences finally reached the center of everything he had been protecting, I did not feel celebration the way I once thought I would, because revenge is not always loud or satisfying in the way anger imagines. Sometimes it is quiet, structured, and irreversible in a way that does not require witnessing every detail. What mattered more to me was not what he lost in that moment, but what I had regained long before that moment arrived. My stability, my independence, and my ability to see my own life without being filtered through his deception. By the time he finally understood that the situation had shifted beyond repair, there was no emotional space left for negotiation, because I had already stepped out of the version of life where he had any authority over my direction. And when everything settled into its final form, I realized something that stayed with me longer than the entire experience itself. That betrayal does not destroy everyone. Sometimes it rebuilds the person who survives it into someone who can never be controlled the same way again. I did not need to announce my victory, and I did not need validation from anyone who had once misunderstood my silence, because the truth of my transformation was already written in the life I continued living without him. And as I stood in that final realization, I understood something very clearly, that the end of his illusion was not the beginning of my revenge. It was the moment. I finally returned to myself,